Hi, welcome back for the second lecture, which is on violence and the body. Now, this lecture is going to focus on the work of another trio of American artists, Lee Bontecou, Melvin Edwards and Nancy Grossmann. We're going to continue to explore the role of abstraction in these artists' reconfigurations of the body, and we're also going to continue to focus on art made in New York in the 1960s, with a particular emphasis on the ways in which violence began to emerge as a key, but again often implicit or abstract theme in the large aggressive objects made by these three artists. Although largely abstract, Bontecou and Edwards in particular, works by these artists are often talked about by art historians as engaged with themes of violence, race and sexuality, in the form of their forbidding metal, fabric and leather wall-mounted relief sculptures, and in the case of Grossmann, the terrifying freestanding portrait busts that she began to make in the late 60s, and in Edwards' case with his imposing Lynch Fragments series of relief sculpture. The theme of today's lecture picks up from the previous one on abstraction and the body, and we're going to focus in particular on the theme of violence and its intersection with the body, and we're going to also be thinking about the intersectionality of their practices with questions of power, race and gender. We're going to remain in the 60s, looking at artists working in America at that time, at the same time, in fact, that many of our other examples from last session were also establishing themselves as artists. We're going to look at two women and one male artist. We've got Lee Bontecou at top left here with one of her large-scale wall reliefs made from metal and fabric. In the middle, we've got the African-American sculptor Melvin Edwards, Some Bright Morning from his Lynch Fragments series, who, as you can see, like Bontecou, also works in a relief format. And then to the right, one of Nancy Grossmann's life-size human heads carved from wood and covered in black leather masks or skins. This is our trio today. I think what's quite clear just from looking at these examples now is that each does speak to a kind of violence, but through an abstract or a semi-abstract mode. So we'll continue to think about the role of abstraction in this lecture, building on our previous one where our privileged terms were the erotic and questions of gender. And we're going to work through each artist before bringing them together towards the end, as we did last time. So we'll think about how the issue of violence in the body, as well as questions of gender and the erotic, are figured in these three artists' works, who each refused to let their work settle as meaning or symbolising any one specific thing. That's a key theme this morning. How did they make works that refused to settle in terms of their meaning or symbolic power? These are not works that contain a message, but remain open and force us to ask questions about our work, about the work and about ourselves. Where do we see violence in the works? Where is the body? Whose body does the work address? Ours as the viewer? Or does the work somehow abstractly conjure an image of the body, even if only fantastically or psychologically? And I'm thinking back to Louise Bourgeois' personage sculpture series, which she said were abstract memories of the people she'd left behind in France, and she understood them as bodily substitutes for her family and friends at home. We might think of them in those terms too. We're looking at an installation shot of two works by Lee Bontecou here. Now, you'll see the one to the left is perhaps one that is more familiar from her early 60s practice. It's a very dark and dirty looking wall relief, and look at the projection, the way it really stands out from the wall. This is a work made from a welded metal structure or skeleton over which she adheres taut patches of reclaimed fabric, sacking, leather, denim, in order to produce these arcs and crests of projected panels. On the back wall is actually quite a surprising work by her. It's in the collection of the Pompidou Centre in Paris, and it's an early example of her occasional experimentation with fiberglass, a very lightweight material, and this has been lit by one single bulb that sits in the centre and is embedded in the back of the armature of the work. And for me, this is a really interesting work because it sort of articulates explicitly what many commentators have said about Bontecou's relief sculpture, which is that they almost recall stained glass with their patchwork series of portions that seem to cohere as a form of welded glasswork. And I think this is illuminated quite explicitly and obviously literally in that work there. Now, Bontecou worked in New York from the late 50s. She trained at a time when artists were beginning to work often with ready-made and found objects, such as the earliest surrealist artists in Europe in the early years of the 20th century. The difference between those earlier surrealist artists in Europe and the later American generation of scavengers was that the Americans were far less interested in the unconscious poetics of random juxtaposition that defined the earlier ready-made found objects of the surrealists, who would enjoy walking through flea markets in Paris, waiting for random objects to suddenly spark a moment of desire in them which spoke to their unconscious. Artists such as Bontecou were not interested in that side of things. They were interested in ready-made found materials as the raw, blunt expression of contemporary urban life. Bontecou would trawl New York's Canal Street, site of many repair shops, industrial warehouse suppliers and art supply stores. There and in the junkyards around Canal Street, Bontecou and her contemporaries would reclaim washers, recycled parts of old washing machines and dryers, old postal sacks, burlap, so sort of heavy Hessian sacking, cut up denim, wire. These are the kind of materials that she's collecting and using in her work. Although interestingly, her earliest practice was handmade terracotta animals. She had a really interesting period of working with fired terracotta before this break and move into the urban industrial aesthetic of the early 60s. Relief is an odd format. We talked about this in the last lecture, the ways in which it's a sculptural form that's taking the place of a two-dimensional painting or wall-mounted work. And what artists like Bontecou are interested in, as was Kusama, if you remember her soft wall reliefs, is the element of protrusion and projection that the wall offers. It's both contained by its framing, but at the same time it appears to burst out from the wall. They're formally confusing, and this slide shows that really nicely, because when they're photographed fully frontally, they look two-dimensional and the projection is impossible to make sense of, whereas the second image, which is an in situ photograph, shows you that in fact that central void does not sink in but projects or lurches out at an angle. Bontecou backs her reliefs with sheets of thick black velvet which doesn't reflect light, and so when you stand in front of them and you peer into that void, you can see nothing but blackness. There's no sense of how far that projection goes, although in some instances it's over 1.5 meters before you would reach the wall if you were brave enough to stick your hand inside. And when you're faced with these works, they have a smell, a cool air that's coming from that interior cavity. They feel quite overwhelming when you're faced with them, and it was precisely this that Bontecou sought. This is a funny photograph from a French newspaper in 1964 when Bontecou was included in the Documenta exhibition. What we have is a male viewer who has poked his head inside one of the cavities, and the headline says, "Is this an exhaust pipe?" No, it's sculpture, and it touches exactly on this motif of what is it we're looking at here, that Bontecou's works seem to be like mouths or eyes. He seems to be being decapitated by its this chomping cavity, but at the same time they look like machine parts or mechanical objects. This is really clear in Untitled from 61, which instead of having an empty black cavity or void, has the central hole filled with two bandsaw teeth that Bontecou has curved round to fit the hole. So these very sharp teeth have been formed into an abstract suggestion of a mouth or perhaps a mechanical eye. And you see with the two sections of dirty rope hanging from the side of the work that immediately seem to be a playful invitation to us to reach out and pull or tug. And that, of course, sets off a chain of associations, wondering what might happen if I do that. Will this set off a mechanical chain of activity? Will the mouths and eyes start chomping or winking? Will a sound be emitted? This idea that it's a work on the cusp of animation is a powerful part of their presence when suspended on the wall. They're funny, I think they're monstrous, but they're also, I think we can say quite clearly, abstract. These are my projections onto the work. These are the readings that I'm offering you. Her works test us. They test how far our imaginative faculties will take us in interpreting these works, which ends up being rather more about me than perhaps the work itself. We might think of it as a figurative body or bodily surrogates, recalling again the personages of Bourgeois, but I think the game here is always the extent to which the work resists settling as any one thing. Here are some installation shots of her in her loft working. Now these are probably posed for the photographer rather than literally Bontecou working on the objects, but she is performing for the photographer and so us how the works are made, and they are incredibly helpful for that reason. I think we see immediately there's an element of danger literally in the production of these works. She's wearing her protective face mask as she holds the welding torch in her hands, because to make these works she welds that metal armature or skeleton, which she actually then can lift around and move into place. And at that point she begins, and you see this in the image to the right, to take sections of fabric, leather, sacking, often water-stained or bearing the stamps of the US Postal Service. She doesn't mind the dirtiness of the fabrics, and she then stretches them tautly between those welded sections, and she takes short sections of sharp copper wire and pierces it through the fabric and twists it around that metal armature, and she does this several times around each section of fabric until it's pulled as taut as possible to cover the skeleton as a skin. In fact, over years, the tautness has been a problem, and when you see them installed often now, you see the small tears and holes as the fabric begins to give. They also, when you see them in person, and you can see on some of these images too, all of the copper twists that hold the surface in place are very visible, and they seem to almost like sharp little hairs or spikes that come away from the surface, adding a sense of frisson to the notion that if you were to touch this work, it's probably going to be quite sharp. But such is the nature of their complexity of construction that the sense of wanting to touch them, to find out how they work through haptic, through tactile means, is really quite intense. This is a very early assemblage work Bontecou made, and I always find this very curious because it stands alone in her body of work as perhaps the most figurative thing she made after the terracotta sculptures of the 50s, and it's assembled from various oddments and bits and bobs she's found. And if you notice, running along the top like a sharp spine is one set of those bandsaw teeth we see filling the voids of some of the wall reliefs a couple of years later. Now this is clearly a gun. It doesn't work, it wouldn't work, but this is more figurative than many of her other works, and for me this really explicitly makes clear to us there is an interest, a concern with violence running through Bontecou's work that becomes increasingly abstracted but is nonetheless there from the start. I'm juxtaposing her work here with a crushed metal work by the sculptor John Chamberlain. he made his works at this time from bits of old reclaimed automobile, which he with a sledgehammer would bash and hammer into shape. So what we're witnessing is the aftermath of a violent process of construction, which itself speaks to perhaps a language of accident, of an automobile crash that we're bearing witness to the aftermath of. These works are hung on the wall like reliefs, although you see their enormous heft, like Bontecou's work to the right, which is in the collection of MoMA in New York, seem to barely bear the weight of their own construction. They almost look as if they might fall off the wall and crush us. Now, I'm giving you this juxtaposition because it is one made at the time in 1961 in a group exhibition called The Art of Assemblage at the Museum of Modern Art, which paired Bontecou and Chamberlain in the catalogue, as if to suggest that there is a shared language of aggression and construction in their work. I think that there's an allusion to abstract violence here, a violence to materials, to the wall, to our expectations, and also I would just encourage you to look up photographs of John Chamberlain at work, because he very much played up to the idea of his practice as a very macho, aggressive one. He's often got his shirt off. You see him wielding his sledgehammer. He was a very, very performative artist. He would talk about the construction of his works as a sexual fit. He understood that process of smashing and hammering parts together as a form of sexual union, which is a very peculiar vocabulary given the insistently industrial mechanical appearance of the final works. But this is a world apart from the way in which Bontecou would discuss her own works at this time in very formal, material and non-figurative terms. So why this language of violence then? And you'll recall from reading Donald Judd's essay on Bontecou that he struggles with this too. He is a minimalist sculptor. He's a critic who is very focused on the formal aspects of sculptural production, and yet he lights upon the work of Bontecou, which he admires enormously, but at the same time he ends up by the close of that essay absolutely seduced by a language of warfare, violence and sexual imagery that would seem to be quite a lot of projection on Judd's part onto Bontecou's work. And I find that a really surprising piece of writing that perhaps betrays more about Judd than he perhaps meant at the time of writing, as he grapples with the issue of how to write about a practice that's so abstract and formally imaginative, yet at the same time seems to speak to questions of the abstract, erotic and violent. Bontecou says that she would make her works with the radio on in her loft, and she has said, when pressed, that perhaps violence figures in her work as a kind of haunting. She recalls accounts of violence in Africa, the burgeoning and increasingly escalating situation with the US intervention in the Vietnam War at this time, and injustices as well closer to home with the burgeoning civil rights movement that sought racial equality. And these are the kinds of news stories that she's hearing as she makes her work, and she suggests that perhaps this sense of injustice, of violence, did begin to seep into her works at the time. Okay, so we'll now move on to Melvin Edwards. This is his Some Bright Morning from the Lynch Fragments series. It's from 1963. Edwards is an African-American sculptor who was born in Texas in 1937. He has come to a lot more critical and art historical attention in recent years, and is now considered a very important artist from this period, and one who it's very exciting that we now have a lot more art historical scholarship on and can begin to think with. So he grew up in the segregated South, a world apart from New York City. As an African-American artist, he was able to trace his origins through his great-great-great-grandfather, Fred Felton, who he discovered was a traditional African blacksmith. Now, Edwards doesn't know what country his grandfather came from, as he was brought as a young adult into slavery and sold in one of the ports in the New York area to a family in the South. Now, this is a very common story, and in fact, even the information Edwards does have, knowing that very far back in his family past was a blacksmith, is a piece of information many descendants of enslaved people do not have. Now, this is a story that he holds dear, and the point, though, is Edward's story is important to his own sense of self and his working practice, but it in no way defines him or shuts down other interpretations of his work. That's the key thing that we need to think about with Edwards. Certainly the fact that he was born and lived through the segregated South, that he's a black artist, is not all we would want to say or know about him, and to define his work solely in terms of who their maker is would be a very reductive process. But it does matter to us as art historians that there is a difference. And it matters to Edwards too, in terms of the histories of art we tell. He just doesn't want it to shut down other interpretations of his work. Africans, he points out, were making art both figurative and abstract long before they came into contact with European art. And that's a history he very much wants to hold on to. So let's look at this Lynch fragment here. This series of works are abstract, but they contain many references. And as Michael Brenson says in his essay on the Lynch fragments that you've read, they readily evoked for some viewers African masks, while for others they noticed the individual elements making up the works, the knives, the scissors that suggest another kind of violence, or the incorporation of chains. You see that chain hanging down from the side there, which might suggest slavery, but also, of course, chains suggest connection, the links that join up to make a whole. I think that we can talk about these as resistant objects, as with Bontecou's too, that there is a sense in which they both speak to a certain set of issues but spiral out into other kinds of projections and ways we might think about them. Brenson also points out that because these works are anchored to the wall, they are literally restrained. So it isn't just the symbolism of the chains, the works are themselves literally restrained by their formal positioning. So I'll show you here an installation view of the Lynch fragments, because this is how Edwards wants them to be shown. He's very particular about this. They are from the floor to the top of the work is always 6 feet, and the gap between each work is 3 feet, which is about his arm span outstretched. So each is given their own space to occupy. They're often shown on a curved wall, which you see here too, which means as you walk along their length, you look back to previous fragments as you move through the installation. But as the curved wall seems to somehow envelop or contain you, there's a sense of being drawn into the installation yourself. Edwards has made over 200 Lynch fragments to date. He's made them in 3 discrete periods, the first of which was between 1963 and 67, and he still makes them now. Now, the title that he includes after the individual name of each work in brackets, Lynch fragment, is important, and we need to think about that. Lynching, as some of you may know, was an informal mob ruling that resulted in the brutal murder of many African Americans in the United States during the worst period of segregation under what's known as the so-called Jim Crow era. Now, Jim Crow laws were state and federal laws that enforced racial segregation across America. They began after the end of the American Civil War in the 19th century and carried on well into the 20th century. I think we might argue that aspects of informal mob ruling continues today. If you think about the Black Lives Matter in recent years that insist that we attend to the ongoing forms of brutality, shockingly often police brutality, we witness in the United States towards black American men. If you think about the escalating crisis of incarceration of young black men in the United States in particular, too, the Black Lives Matter movement would argue that this is part of a much longer series of problems to do with racism in the United States history. And just for some historical context, between 1882 and 1968, there are nearly 5,000 documented cases of lynching, of the murder of innocent black men by these informal community mobs. Now, when asked about his very evocative titles, Edwards has said, if the social aspects of life and the artistic ones aren't the same thing, then they are at least metaphors for one another. So he allows the works to function perhaps metaphorically rather than literally. We'll just come back here to Some Bright Morning to think a little bit more about what we're looking at. So he's working largely with welded steel, although he later incorporates elements in bronze and chrome. There's various parts of metal oddments that he incorporates and welds together alongside prefabricated forms such as scissor blades, razor blades, cogs, drain covers, etc. Various metal items, much as Bontecou would do, that he incorporates and juxtaposes in these forms. They're quite... they're about the size perhaps of a head when you look at them. Some are much smaller. You see this one here is a drain cover, so you can imagine the size of that. Others slightly larger, but they are very contained, dynamic forms that seem to puncture the wall of the gallery, just as Bontecou's projections seem to burst out or away. Brenton says of Edwards that he breaks things apart and puts them back together again. Now that seems quite a simple statement, but I think what Brenton's getting at here is this idea of somehow the process of making these works having a redemptive function for Edwards, that somehow they do work as a form of mourning or memorial, that by the process of bringing these elements together and naming them as the Lynch Fragments, they function as an abstract invocation or memorial to those lost lives. Here's two more examples, Sunday and Afro Phoenix 1. That doesn't mean he doesn't have contemporaries in the American modernist art world at that time that we shouldn't think about him in relation to. He was good friends with the modernist sculptor David Smith. We're looking at one of his own welded works from the 50s to the left here, which I've placed next to one of Edwards's own welded works from 65. Both were interested in working with welded materials to form abstract juxtapositions. And here we see Edwards in his studio working on one of his works. You see that oversized giant chain to the side of him there. And one of his works, Ace, which is from 63. Notice the gloves, the denims, the goggles. It's a very kind of macho moment. And just as with John Chamberlain and perhaps even with Bontecou, this idea of seeing artists working in such unusual ways meant that we have a wonderful photographic archive of these artists at work. Here is Edwards, and here is his friend Smith working in his workshop. You noticed it's almost a uniform. It's also a suggestion of the artist no longer as an isolated from everyday life, but almost as a blue-collar worker. And David Smith absolutely framed himself in quite macho ways as a form of art making that was far from the refined world of fine art, but was working with the materials and stuff of the everyday industrial labourer. Make of that what you will. I think the gendering of these practices is really, really interesting. This is a work by Edwards called Chaino from 1964. It's a series of railroad spikes, hooks and chains, and they've been suspended from a three-dimensional frame. It's a format he does use on occasion. You see it's freestanding. So this is often read as an abstract meditation on incarcerated black bodies. And if you take a moment to look at that, you might begin to see why that reading has come to dominate the work. But Edwards wants to take that idea and abstract it. He says, if the metaphor for lynching was hanging was an aspect of the idea of suspension that led me to start working with suspension as a principle in the work. So yes, perhaps suspension comes from hanging, comes from lynching, but in reclaiming that term in his work here, it has other interpretations that might open onto. For him, yes, chains speak of enslaved bodies, but they're also a device for connecting. They're about kinship, links to the past. They suggest memory and a form of connection that he wants to hang on to as well. Perhaps it's read too straightforwardly as about the incarcerated body. Certainly Edwards does offer up another possible reading that might interest readers, which is that the title of the work was inspired by African-American jazz music. Chano is a combination of the names of Chano Pozo and Chino Pozo, who were Cuban drummers who brought Afro-Cuban drumming into the Dizzy Gillespie Orchestra. So there's actually a sense of musicality, of intersectionality happening here with these works as a kind of improvisational, almost rhythmic instantiation of music and the kinds of community that can produce, even as that lingering sense of the incarcerated, chained body persists. He's refusing to let them settle as one thing or another. And it's this aspect of abstraction and violence that's shared by Nancy Grossmann, who is going to be our final case study today. Here's Grossmann at work, a very different form of stitching to Bontecou, but nonetheless here she is working on the completion of one of her leather heads. Interpretations of these rather terrifying leather heads ranges from understanding them as a reference to the subculture of New York's masochistic clubs, although certainly her heads were incredibly popular with that community who were would frequently commission works from Grossmann and sustained her practice. But others have read them as subversive objects that perhaps recall fetish or so-called primitive masks and objects. Others have understood them as racialized, as the black repurposed leather, suggesting that these are images of black heads. I think it's clear that none of these is really sufficient, and the reading around this, particularly David Getsy's writing on Nancy Grossmann, offers very powerful readings of her heads that those of you who are interested might want to go back and look into. He also discusses very interestingly Grossmann's early relationship with David Smith, which is another form of connection between our artists we're looking at today. Another connection is that Grossmann also worked in relief, and we have here an early circular format relief work by her called The Bride. But once we see the image itself, this title becomes immediately disquieting. This feels a world away from questions of purity or joy or love, and seems to speak more to the aftermath of a violent scene of some sort. It's unclear which way round we look at this work. What I notice immediately are the leather straps, the belts running across the top, and also wondering what this white leather fabric is. So I can tell you it's an old ice skating boot that she has picked apart and mounted in all its folds and punctured, studded fabric into this circular framework. And if we just look here at this strange detail, this reddish slit that seems to register as a wound or possibly as female genitalia, which immediately demands a whole different set of questions about what kind of bride, what the scenario is that we seem to have either unwittingly stumbled upon, or the erotics or the violence of this work, which combined produce an incredibly intense and disquieting set of readings you might want to think about in more detail. Another relief work, Ali Stoker, is much larger than The Bride. This is an enormous rectangular wall-mounted piece which is made of cut-up sections of black leather jackets. You see alongside those the pockets and zips are employed as various orifices through which metal and rubber pipes and tubing snake and weave. This either recalls a section of some kind of demonic machine, or it's an image of penetration that can be read in fairly explicitly sexual terms. Again, there's a play between both here. Now, the black leather jacket was an iconic object of the 50s and 60s in America. It stood for rebellion, for machismo. It was entirely understood as an expression of youthful masculinity. It was anti-establishment. James Dean, perhaps, is the archetypal figure we might think of here. However, and David Getsy talks about this, by 1968 leather jackets were also coded as homosexual, that this would be a coded language that gay men in particular could wear leather jackets as a way of signalling to each other their membership of a homosexual community that at this point had no voice or political stakes in New York in particular. So it immediately to that audience would speak of alternative sexualities, and of course a wonderfully playful subversion of the idea of the machismo of James Dean that's been insistently queered through its adoption by the gay community. Here are some details of that painting. One's black and white to the right, where you see the creases and folds of the leather jacket that unmistakably remind us this is skin, and the very suggestive penetration of that zip with the phallic tubing. And then to the left you see another one of those oblique shots that really help us get a sense of the projection of these works, that remind us this is absolutely not a two-dimensional painting, but something that belongs in the world of things and materials and objects. Okay, so let's look at some of those heads in a bit more detail. They're often displayed as multiples. You see them here placed on tabletops, sort of decapitated. At first people assumed that these were mannequin heads, but I think if you just think about that for a second, it's quite clear that's not quite right. What kind of mannequin would this enormous, very highly defined, featured head belong to? Shop mannequins tend to be almost exclusively depicting female bodies, or certainly they take on a much more a delicate air than these massive monumental heads. In fact, she made the heads, the early ones Grossmann made herself by carving them out of soft wood, so sections of telegraph poles, for instance. Later on she worked with plastic moulding, and you see this one here is a plastic moulded version, but early on she would make the heads herself and cover them with these patchworked leather masks. Now, the idea of them being a mask is very important to me, because what we're witnessing here is not a single contained object, because she lets that nose poke through. She lets us see that there is an object underneath the leather skin, which immediately turns that leather skin into a mask, into an addition or a layer, something that's been superimposed on top of the head. And once we start to notice the bound mouths and the blind eyes and the closed off ears, they begin to take on an incredibly repressive and rather intimidating undertone, an idea of voices silenced, of agency of the subject having been removed. Now, what's very interesting about these works is that Grossmann, when asked, would just say they're autobiographical. And you might want to think about that. What on earth does it mean for a work such as this to be autobiographical when we know that they look nothing like the artist? For these to be a form of self-portraiture seems to be quite a leap. Now, why would you insist they're autobiographical? Is it to refuse to let the work settle? Is it a way of resisting the assumption that these are male heads? Is it to insist on gender fluidity, to place under pressure the assumption that you can gender these as either male or female, as if one or two of those terms even applies? And certainly in the more fantastical of these works, there's one we'll see in a moment that's got horns. The question of gender seems beside the point, as they seem to defy very notions of the human entirely. David Getsy thinks it's worth noting that Grossmann later comes out as a lesbian and thinks that maybe the questions of gender play and fluidity might be part of a identity formation for Grossmann, and you might want to read his work and think about whether you find that a convincing argument or not. It's certainly a very powerful one. So I'm just showing you here two really beautiful photographs by Richard Avedon that also demonstrate her working process, because to the left we see these uncovered heads, and then you see some in progress, not quite finished, tumbled together in the second photograph. I'll show you these two, which I think, so one's from 1970, one's from 77, that do begin to suggest perhaps some kind of awareness of the S&M community, given the language and imagery and the names that she's giving them here. Also, again, notice the mouth has been silenced with this flap, with these poppers, blinkers over the eyes, and that element of the fantastical I alluded to, with the horns to the side here. Here's another work that again recalls the complicated ways in which we might think about chains, and also the S&M community based on a practice of the erotics of submission and violence, of aggression, that I think is very hard to disentangle from the work she's doing at this point. But we need to heed seriously her own insistence that when she began making these heads, she had no awareness of that community and the aesthetics of the leather and rubber outfits and accoutrements of that community, that I think to our eyes now seems rather more obvious than perhaps it did at the time. And we might want to think in more abstract terms, as we did with Edwards, about the ways in which these works speak to questions of silencing and incarceration. I'll just briefly show you two drawings, one by Grossmann, one by Bontecou, because I find it very interesting that both of these artists are much more figurative on paper with the drawn line than when they work in 3 dimensions, which is when the figurative and the softer, more bodily aspects of their drawings seems to drop out, and we're left with rather more insistently abstract forms. I think there's a sense of human expressivity to the Grossmann heads, even the way the shape of the skull gently curves towards the back, the fact that these two heads rarely seem to be in some kind of conversation, whereas they tend to stand alone in 3 dimensions. And Bontecou, who has rendered a gas mask, a face, something that seems incredibly organic, which you can imagine once we see this turned into a relief with the cavities and voids, really loses that softer sense of a bodily presence. She would also talk about how old gas masks from the Second World War were often found around junk shops at this time, and that brooding sense of fear that would produce would haunt her practice. So let's just bring our artists together to conclude in a productive conversation to see where we are. Hopefully the threads and links are becoming clear. These 2 lectures that we've had so far intersect in significant ways. We noticed that in today's session, all our artists are American. They were all working in America in the 60s, but continue to work now. All were engaged in thinking about and figuring the body, but not in straightforwardly representational modes, which is another way of saying that they're all thinking about abstraction. We want to think about their materials, the role of abstraction, the role and the presence or absence of the body. Questions of projection, the use of the wall as an architectural space, as a limit for the work to protrude or jut or burst from, or perhaps in the case of Edwards, that seem to puncture or cut into the wall, the ways in which they press into our space physically as well as psychologically. Here's another relief, Scarab by Grossmann. We might think about the historical and the political in how we think about these works. For Edwards, he was very clear that the civil rights movement and questions of race matter enormously to his sense of self and his practice, certainly with the Lynch Fragments, and his employment of abstraction, as we've discussed, is a very, very sophisticated one. Bontecou, remember, worked with the radio on in her studio, said her works were haunted by news of war in the world, of violence. Also, like Grossmann, Bontecou always said that she felt connected to abstract painting. It's interesting, neither of those rejected earlier modes of abstraction, but understood their work as taking it in a new direction. For Grossmann, her works were autobiographical, even as they spoke to a burgeoning S&M culture and have been reclaimed by many historians and critics as important interventions in the queering of the 60s eccentric abstract art world that we might want to think about too. So violence is an undercurrent running through all of these works. Why would a work of art seek to unsettle us? What's happened at this moment where artworks seek to produce an air of disquiet, of psychological anxiety perhaps, of burgeoning threats? Are they solely references to the social, cultural, historical moment they're made? How do they resonate for us now? What do we want to say or do with these works? How do we want to think about the intersections of gender, of violence, of race, of questions of sexuality? How do they figure or not in these works? I think that the themes that we've looked at today are helpful in returning to the previous lecture and looking at those eccentric abstraction works that absolutely engaged with notions of the abstract erotic, even as they too engaged questions of ambivalence and violence. And to think about this as a set of questions, what I described as a toolkit for working through a language of sexuality and abstraction that we will return to in more explicit terms in the final lecture, where we look towards the end of the 60s, where the language of eroticism, sexuality and violence took on a more explicit and explicitly political edge in the work of a number of artists who affiliated with the women's movement and the rise of feminism towards the end of the decade. And I will see you again for that final